Something I was saying earlier is like, I don't have the education or training for any of this, but there is one thing that I think makes me a good person to be doing this work is that I have a very intersectional experiences that may become increasingly more obvious the more we talk, is that I come from a background of multiple religions, multiple races. I am trans, intersex, disabled. I have lots of identities that aren't considered by society the norm. And essentially, my main goal is bringing intersectional leftism, intersectional feminism to the genital autonomy movement.
The Intact Again podcast is an oral history project where we share stories from those who have been circumcised and are working to restore what was taken from us. Our hope is to inspire each other with our collective stories of loss and recovery.
Hello and welcome to the Intact Again podcast. Our next guest is Allie, a 27-year-old activist for genital autonomy who truly embodies intersectionality. She grew up in a family that was Jewish, Muslim, and Catholic. She is also intersex and a transfeminine person who has been restoring since middle school. She is now a CI7. She speaks from personal experience to the similarities between recovering from genital cutting through restoring and her experiences as a trans person and how both aspects of her life cause dysphoria in different but often very similar ways. Content warning: we do discuss sexual violence and abuse in this episode. And without further ado, here is Allie's story, or as we like to call it, her re-story.
Allie, or Catelyn, as I've mentioned. I go by she, her pronouns. I think that's also another thing that's relevant. I would say I am like an early CI7, and the amount of time that I've been restoring is a very difficult thing to nail down because I started in my teenage years aggressively but inconsistently. So like when I was on it, I was doing 10 hours a day and probably with way too much tension than necessary, but then off of it for months at a time and then getting back to it. Eventually I stopped because I was unable to handle like the emotions around it on top of transitioning. I'm a trans feminine person and intersex, and there is the thought in my mind that maybe this will just go away. Once I'm like transitioning, I might get bottom surgery anyways, and then I won't see it, right? But that's not true. That's not how any of that works. It affects that, obviously.
I have heard that some people that transition will specifically restore in order to help with the transition process if they do choose to go with bottom surgery.
Absolutely. And that's something that I like want to educate people about with what I do. I have been transitioning for a very long time, like 10 years, basically. And that sort of thing was definitely not in the social zeitgeist then. So I just stopped restoring for like 5 years, maybe, and tried to forget about it. And eventually it came back up. I don't know, I was thinking maybe doing some like sex work or something like that. It didn't necessarily happen, like OnlyFans, but it came up because of that. And like, well, fuck. And then I started restoring again and getting into restoring spaces and fell down the rabbit hole and have been much more consistent since then. And that was 3 years ago. Probably have logged like 4,000 hours actually recording my time restoring since then. So the Genital Autonomy Collective started as a branch off from a genital autonomy support space. And I could not find one that was explicitly accepting of queer and in particular trans, intersex, and gender diverse peoples. And I started a Discord support group and have been growing that and branching out from that. At the moment, I run like a weekly support group specifically for trans, intersex, and gender diverse peoples. But I have started another server that is essentially the same thing, but is inclusive to cis parasex people and people who aren't gender diverse. Parasex being people who are not intersex, and also cis being people that aren't trans. And I'm kind of branching off with that even further from that group as well. And so essentially I'm calling it like a network of peer support groups, and I'm hoping that other people will start their own. There may be like local variants as well. Currently, I have quite a few people in Oregon, to the point where I think eventually we'll start a local group here. The main goal of it is basically to reduce the misconception that the genital autonomy movement is attached to the right wing, and provide a starting point for people on the left to get involved with genital autonomy advocacy, and to support those people who are potentially getting into it or just need the support, because it is exhausting to be the only voice in that position. We have a website, and it's the autonomycollective.org. I figured not including genital would help with visibility of it. And speaking of other activism that I'm doing, I'm going to be at Pride in my city working with GalDef. We're partnering with them sort of, but a lot of members of the Genital Autonomy Collective are volunteering for a booth that they're running.
And could you explain their organization?
GalDef is essentially an organization that's working on obtaining legal protection for genital autonomy. They are the Genital Autonomy Legal Defense and Education Fund. They primarily are like funding legal cases and educating people for the sake of these legal cases.
We need more of that, so I'm glad that both your organizations exist.
I am very happy to be partnering with them on this. That's a lot of what my recent activism work has been like, going back and forth between our two organizations, communicating with their board, making sure that like volunteers' needs are met.
When it comes to circumcision, when did you first realize you were circumcised, and how would you say that intersects with other things you discovered about yourself? Because people aren't just one thing. It all kind of blends together.
Absolutely. That is a question that I think I have a very weird story with. And there's a lot of content warnings. I mean, this is a content warning on top of a content warning. We're obviously talking about violated genital autonomy, but I've also been sexually abused, and that played a large role in me discovering that I was circumcised. That was when I was like 7 years old. The person who sexually abused me groomed me by providing me with lots of resources without any sort of parental filter. This was in like the 2000s, so children my age did not usually have access to the internet. It's not like children with an iPad today. And it's also the early 2000s internet without the same barriers and protections that are there in place today. So I was on the internet looking at material that was sexually explicit as a very, very small child because of that situation. I ended up in places like 4chan and Omegle. I see the face you're making there, yeah. So that's how I discovered that. And when I had discovered it, was like, I went through like a process of denial as a small child. Like, oh, there's no way my parents would have done that to me, right? And I believed that for only a few days before I kept looking.
A lot of people go through a state of denial. Oh, this couldn't have happened to me. My parents would never do this. Or they say, oh, it can't be bad because my parents wouldn't do something bad to me.
Yeah, exactly.
The thing is, I don't think there really is a typical way that people find out about this. I'm, of course, sorry that you went through the grooming and the abuse, because that is not the greatest way of finding out about any of this, because that just layers an extra layer of...
Yeah, that's probably also part of why it in the past has been such a triggering, trauma-inducing sort of thing for me. And part of why I ended up taking that 5-year break around the subject.
how did you overcome that association in order to get to a CI7?
A lot of therapy where I was ignoring the issue for years. And like I was saying before, when it was inconsistent and aggressive about restoring, it was sort of because of that. It was like I could only handle doing it in short amounts of time before I just like break down and not be able to continue. And eventually I talked about it in therapy and with other people so much that the sort of trigger has calmed down to enough to the point that I can actually do the activism work and restoring work that I'm doing.
People talk about how hard it is to find mental health advocates that will actually take what happened to us seriously. How did you find somebody that was supportive?
I would say through a lot of trial and error. I've had a lot of therapists over my life, and not all of them have been accepting. And particularly the first therapist I had was terrible about it because I was still dependent on my parents and living with them at the time. And he had betrayed my patient confidentiality on the issue. I didn't really say anything too specific besides just the fuck you and left. But
Honestly, I think that was an appropriate response.
yeah.
The breaking of patient confidentiality,
Mhm.
such an egregious breach of trust. I would have trouble trusting people after that.
I absolutely did. I mean, to be fair, I had issues trusting people my whole childhood, given the experiences of abuse that I had and people not believing me as well. And the baseline of trust that I had was very low, and it only gone up from there, I will say. That whole situation with that therapist was kind of a breach of patient confidentiality because they were the colleague of my mother, who is a therapist.
That is, wow, that is a breach of trust on so many levels.
And there are definitely some tips that I would give to like trying to find someone who's not going to be that far below the bar that's on the ground. Like that would primarily be try to find a therapist who is probably queer would be preferred. Queer or like neurodivergent informed people tend to be a bit better on the issue. In particular, people who are not cis men, I would say. And if they are binary younger women, younger generally, before people have had children. And once someone is connected to the issue in the way by like having a child and having perpetuated circumcision, they're much less likely to be willing to like question it on a whim.
Once they do something like this, cognitive bias starts coming in and they try to defend their psychological need to not think that they did something bad. And at that point, you're almost dealing with them and their issues instead of them dealing with your issues.
Yeah, exactly. Honestly, even with my current therapist, I would say that it's come up in that way a little bit because when I was like scoping them out in the what do you call it when you like essentially having your first interview with them to see if they're the right provider for you. There's a term for it, but I'm blanking on it. But I had brought it up and they had said that they were also personally affected by it. And that's something that they had done some work on in the past. And then I could tell, like, in the moment, I don't necessarily know that this isn't a triggering thing for them right now at all. Like, I could feel like there is something above baseline. And I have noticed that coming up less and less and as our sessions have continued. So I mean, I honestly think that they are essentially probably working on it as well in some sense. And it's kind of like therapists have to do homework about their clients. And if they're not willing to do that homework, then yeah, the good ones do homework on their clients. And it's not at all inappropriate for you to ask if you think the therapist is fine otherwise, them to do homework on the issue, or to straight up say, I don't think this will work because of where you are on this issue. If, of course, you're in a position where you can find another therapist. And I understand I'm in a pretty privileged position having like widely accepted state insurance right now. I have definitely let a few therapists go because of the issue. There is an organization that had signed me a therapist a few years ago, and I had done some research on the therapist and found out that they were quite religious. And one of the first sessions I had with them, I asked them about that and then said, I don't think this is going to work out because I don't think your position in your faith is going to be compatible with the issues that I'm working on, because they're kind of intermingled with religion for me.
Hi, friends. We want to take a break to talk about our Patreon members who are helping us spread the word about the negative effects of circumcision and the possibility of restoration. Our sincere thank you to our newest members, Bryce W., Murad, Benjamin, and Daniel. Our Patreon members donate as little as $3 a month to help us pay for podcast hosting and pay-per-click advertising, and you can too by clicking the link in the show notes. We can change the world when we work together. Please consider becoming a Patreon member today.
When you mean intermingled with religion, that kind of brings us to our next point. What was your family's attitude towards circumcision? And since you mentioned it, was there a religious aspect to the reasons that they decided to circumcise you?
Yeah, there absolutely was. And goodness, it's a pretty complicated situation for me. My mother's side of the family was Catholic and Jewish. There was a part of the family that was Jewish, but primarily my nuclear family was Catholic, but my father's side was Muslim. And there were an agreement made that they would raise their children as they were Catholic because of being in the States. I had found out that me being circumcised was almost entirely fueled by religious motivation because I had stumbled upon a Bible that stuff was underlined in and childcare journals. And someone has a new child, they often will get them and put like first and stuff. There was a page in there about circumcision, and there was information about religion on there that was in my mother's handwriting. And I never personally asked about the religious connection to it, but that felt like pretty much proof enough for me. It's not ever something my parents talked about or really came up in the family. It's definitely taboo to talk about. And sexuality in general was really weird because my mother is Catholic and from a pretty repressive family in that regard. But at the same time, she is also involved in academia and has a lot of what I would call virtue signaling, is that she like seems to want to get past that and say there are more liberal in regards to sex. And a lot of her work has been on sexuality, but I don't think that she's gotten past it. And I think that she's been using that work to try to work through it herself. I felt like she had some aspirations about sex, but she had never worked through the internalizations from her more repressive family. She was saying things like people should be able to talk about like their sexual health and things like that, but you could tell there was shame in it. There was so much shame in it that like it was projected upon her children. And my father, not even just sex, he basically wouldn't talk about anything vulnerable at all. And my father being Muslim, there's some stuff there as well that was kind of repressive, I will say. So as a child, I was receiving very conflicting messages. People saying you should be able to talk about sex and we should be able to talk about sex as a society, but there being so much shame in it and people getting upset when it's mentioned. Or like consent being a very good example, like the sort of, oh, you need to go hug your aunt instead of, are you okay with hugging your aunt? Something as basic as that. And there was very conflicting messages being received. There's things being said like you should be able to like have your consent respected and should be able to say no when things happen like that. But in practice, it never actually happened. Here, I give a better explanation that is directly from the Code of Conduct and Guidelines from GAC, is that intersex people are a demographic, but not a diagnosis. And it should not be restricted to only including like anatomical variations, and is essentially more about an experience of potential alienation, marginalization, and unique self-concept due to the way their body is developed that is different from, say, their peers.
One thing I know that people might have a question about is how is that different, and how may it overlap with someone that is non-binary?
Mm-hmm. So being non-binary is more about gender and maybe potentially presentation, not necessarily. So it's like someone's self-concept that isn't connected to the way that their body has presented naturally or with any sort of changes. I am not non-binary, so it's not something that I necessarily want to speak to as much. But the easiest way to think of it is non-binary is connected to gender, intersex is connected to sex.
How would you define transness?
So transness, or being trans or transgender, is in relation to how you identify compared to how society has tried to define you or tried to assign you. So you can be intersex and trans at the same time, or you can be just intersex. You can be intersex and cis, and you can be intersex and trans. In my example, I was assigned male at birth, and by like my parents and family raised as male, and that conflicted with who I am as a person, which is female. So I'm transgender. I transitioned in a feminine direction, which I usually use the word transfeminine. I'm also intersex. Around when I hit puberty, my body developed with hormones that are atypical for someone who is assigned male at birth. I developed breast, and that affected how I viewed myself. And this is something like I prefer it this way, essentially, and eventually decided that I should transition in a feminine direction. But me transitioning in a feminine direction does not negate my experience as an intersex person and the way that my body developed. And I find that me being intersex is more about I developed atypically for what I would have expected and those around me would have expected, and had experienced some negative things as a result of that. They don't have to be negative. They just have to be different. But in my experience, I was basically unable to use locker rooms with my peers because of the atypical development. And eventually my family tried to get me to take testosterone, and this was not something that I wanted to do. It was against my self-identity and how I viewed myself.
Were you able to prevent them from forcing you to do that?
Yeah, I will say that is definitely a privileged position I have, is that it wasn't something that was extremely obvious when I was born, as far as I'm aware. Most intersex people don't really know exactly because medical records are hidden. Just like in the case of people assigned male at birth experiencing circumcision, the hospitals almost never keep those records beyond a certain amount of time, and it's basically impossible to obtain. So there's a possibility that I've experienced something and I'm not aware of it.
As a intersex trans person, did you think of that as almost an advantage? Because I know, like, in that case, does that mean you don't have to do the hormone shots that a lot of people that transition to more feminine have to?
When I was younger and experiencing that, I did. Now, not as much. I mean, I still need to take hormones because my hormones just were very low across the board beforehand. I regret to say this, but I used to be a trans medicalist, and that is someone who believes that to be trans, someone has to transition medically in experiencing dysphoria, which is a pretty conservative position that I regret that I had. But as an intersex person, that made it very easy for me to say, oh, I'm more valid as a trans person because of that, but is not true. That is absolutely not true. And I had used that to my advantage in my family for them to think that I was valid more so. And for them to be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, and be more likely to let me live. It was a position that I was kind of repressed into, I would say. If I was from a family that was more progressive, I don't think I would have came to that same position.
We covered how you discovered that you were circumcised.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you decide to restore?
It's very intermingled with where we were discussing before, is that I was on these explicit places as a child, like 4chan, and I don't remember exactly where I discovered restoration was possible, but it was in the same vein. It was online through sites that most people probably think I shouldn't have been viewing as a 7-year-old child. And I didn't necessarily start restoring until like probably, I don't know, middle school. It was very inconsistent. Like even as a very small child before then, there were some moments when had tugged, but not knowing that restoration was possible exactly, or that that's how one could restore. It's just something that I was doing because it had bothered me. Something felt wrong. This did not feel right, and it was uncomfortable. Secondly, I had gotten into sports, and in school, I was playing baseball and track and field, and it was extremely uncomfortable doing that. It felt like a disability in a lot of respects. I can't run without chafing because of it. And I started restoring very intensely in high school because of that. And I got to a point where it was no longer being as distressing in the moment. Also, with like the extent of wearing tighter underwear, I had restored just enough so that when I was wearing tighter underwear, it wasn't bothering me. Basically, like a CI5, I would say. That was a large motivation for me restoring, is that it felt disabling in sports that I was trying to do.
What techniques have you used throughout the years? Because we've all used many different techniques.
Mm-hmm. Quite a few, and definitely very different, like across time. As a small child, when I had access to like nothing and couldn't talk to anyone about it, I had basically done manual tagging, and I also did cross taping as a small child, like using band-aids. And that was primarily what I had used as a small child. And then once I had like started actively trying to restore, and not just something is wrong, I want to be comfortable as a child, and realizing that this is actually doing something, I tried like the canister method. And when film canisters were a thing that you could find, I had tried T-taping a little bit. I'd never stayed consistent with it. It was I was a teenager, and also probably dealing with ADHD and all sorts of other stuff. There is a very distinct gap in the techniques that I've been using. I was using very much more makeshift methods than didn't have any marketed devices. Everything was just DIY, very Dick Guyver-y back then.
The Band-Aid thing, I love that. Such a cool, I'm going to do this no matter what. Doesn't matter if I don't have the resources, you're going to make this happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm sure my parents were wondering where the how the Band-Aids are all going.
That brings up a very good point. How was it keeping it a secret from your parents, or was it a secret?
It was absolutely a secret. I mean, anything around sexuality was a secret in the household, despite everything that my mother was saying about sex. I could hear the words, but I may have been autistic, but I definitely understood the whole picture with the body language and stuff, and the shame that was going around there. And also, after that gap, we didn't discuss the methods that I've been using, like after that gap until now. And that's primarily with like strap tugging and inflation.
Were there any close calls when it comes to getting found out? Because I know there was in my case when I was restoring when I was at my parents' place.
I don't think so. I will say my family at the time was quite neglectful, at least in terms of like their physical and emotional presence, not in terms of like my basic needs being met, to that clarification. So my parents were very absent. it was very easy to avoid being caught with anything.
It's something I'm curious about as a transfeminine person. Was it an advantage to be able to wear baggier clothes like skirts and things while restoring?
I just stand up here. I have a dress on and sweatpants. They're a dress with patterns, 2 layers, and I have absolutely gone out in public wearing stuff like this. And there's definitely like some clothing that's a lot harder to wear that I would like to wear sometimes, like leggings. But in some ways, it has been an advantage. But if someone's presenting masks, there are a lot of baggy pants. Mask presenting people don't tend to wear tight pants. I will say that it's something I've had to put a lot more thought into. And it's something that has come up a lot because for most women, I feel like a wardrobe does include a lot of pants that are tighter or shorter shorts or skirts and things. And it's something that I've had to work around a little bit. Whereas when I was presenting mask, just wear a baggier pair of pants, and that's basically it. Earlier, we're talking about tighter underwear. Panties tend to be tighter, and they're, in my opinion, more comfortable. And has overall been kind of nice in terms of like retaining. That's one of the reasons I was able to just forget about restoring for a while, being a CI5 and essentially retaining all of the time wearing panties. The one thing that is a disadvantage is there's no, I've seen people tug like through the hole of men's underwear because that kind of acts as like a ring to hold everything else back.
What challenges, both physical and mental, have you experienced getting to the CI level you are now?
I mean, at first I had mentioned that it was extremely inconsistent because the level of trigger was just too high, being constantly reminded of it. And working on the mental aspect has been by far the biggest increase into the like ease with actually restoring. And I mean, restoring also compounds and helps with that as well.
Was there a point in which it stopped being triggering as a negative thing, it started being triggering as a positive thing? It almost became healing instead of triggering as a reminder of what happened, but becoming a reminder of what will be.
There's definitely still aspects of like the first bit where it's triggering as a negative thing. But I mean, it's also a reminder that I've come a really long way with it. And in a lot of ways has helped with self-actualization in terms of like the activism work that I'm doing. I don't necessarily know that I probably wouldn't be, like I wouldn't have spent as much time educating myself on the subject otherwise, I would assume. So in some ways, yeah.
We talked about keeping it a secret from your family. Do they know that you're restoring now? Like, they know that you're not happy with circumcision, but they know that you're actively restoring.
No, I don't know what my family thinks about like they know that I've had some form of bottom surgery. I never specified. I just told them that I've had surgery. So they probably don't think I have a penis at all right now. And I've just never bothered to correct that.
So when you referred to the surgery, you're referring to the restoration process?
No, I've actually had an orchiectomy, which is removal of testicles. And that has been a massive help with restoration because there's no weight on the scrotum that is like pulling skin away from the foreskin. I haven't told them about restoring, but I have told them about the charity work that I'm doing and like the activism work that I'm doing. So if they wanted to, they could probably find this. I doubt they will. I don't necessarily think they're that proactive in it, but I'm not necessarily hiding it now. I'm just not directly telling them.
I could see that. That makes a lot of sense. There's quite a bit of difference between actively hiding it and just not telling them. How's it changed your perspective on your body? Like your self-perception, the physical changes? What have you noticed?
It's really increased my awareness of what's gender dysphoria and what's CGM dysphoria, because when I was younger, they were extremely intertwined. Like gender dysphoria and child genital cutting dysphoria were so extremely similar feeling that I was just like, I need to have bottom surgery so I don't have to deal with this dysphoria. But as I've restored, I've realized actually I don't want a traditional bottom surgery. I said earlier that I'm a Salmation. I never defined it as it's just essentially someone who wants genitals that aren't traditional to the like typical binary that society expects genitals to be. I was able to like top sexually after I had restored, whereas beforehand I was like, this is not happening.
Has sex improved for you in other ways?
Yeah, absolutely. Not needing lube and oil or anything like that is it makes things so much easier. Like a sensory processing and from like an OCD perspective, and also from like a what if you're hooking up with someone? There is a big step for like if there isn't lube around, from you can't really give someone who's circumcised a hand job without involving bodily fluids, and that is a big step. What's like in terms of risk, that becomes a very different level, and also like there's a different technique involved that people aren't really aware of. Like if they've never had intact partners before, and then if you try that on someone who's intact or has restored, it's quite uncomfortable. I will say.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but before restoring, it was like you just have to hurry up, no interruptions, just try to go as almost like fast and as hard as possible. Because if you lose it, you have to start all over again. And then after restoring, you can stay at that peak for kind of as long as you want. It's you can control it.
I'll say I have a kind of weird experience being intersex as well, is that I had very low hormones before but I have experienced a similar thing to that. Yeah.
I'm very happy for you. You put in a ton of work to get to this point. And the fact that you're helping other people, even though you might not know it, you mentioned earlier that I don't know if anybody else has restored because you've told people about this. Usually they come to those conclusions later.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think even though you might not know it, I think you've changed more lives than you realize. And I thank you for the work you've done.
Thank you. And actually, thinking about it, when I've been putting up posters, even just posters advertising my support group, they mention restoring, but it's not the primary thing that you'll see on it. Like ask, are you unhappy about being circumcised? And circumcised is in huge, huge letters, like across the whole poster, huge letters. Like this one word is an entire line and as big as it can possibly be on that line. And one thing I realized is I am giving people permission to be unhappy about it, to question that. Because I had mentioned that before, there is a gap between being aware someone is circumcised and them being aware that they can be upset about that, or that's something that isn't just a fact of life.
Often you need something like that to allow them to have permission to complain about something with their body, because there's this toxic masculinity that, as you know, you always have to be tough. Don't go to the hospital, use super glue. And
yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely a thing that makes that a much harder gap to bridge. And as one reason why I think that a lot of like trans, queer, and like maybe autistic people tend to be more likely to question if it's the problem that society is doing this and that there's something that's happened to them.
Those that have already questioned one aspect of society and kind of found out that it's full of crap are more willing to question a second aspect of society.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What would you say your end goal is when it comes to restoration? If you know, because you might not know yet.
I have an idea of it. I don't necessarily think I can know because I'll know when I get there, sort of a thing. Maybe, hopefully. It's more about like a feeling, a consistent feeling rather than any concrete thing. Like if I feel restored for a so-and-so period of time, okay, that's probably true, right? But the sort of like objective that I've had has pretty much always been, I want to not be able to see the scar line when I'm at a resting state, which is pretty much always true when I'm flaccid, but not when I'm erect now. So it's sort of have enough erect coverage that the scar line isn't visible.
So you're looking to get a CI9.
Hmm.
That's a good goal. I mean, if you've gone all the way to CI7, I have no doubt you'll be able to make it to a CI9.
Yeah. And I already have like a small amount of erect coverage. Also, I will say there are a lot of factors that make it a little easier for me to get past that than most people. I don't know how much it's okay for me to describe my genitals on here, but
You can describe whatever you want.
I have a very small glans, essentially. So there is a lot less of a physical hump to get over when it comes to that. I hear people that it like skip from CI3 to CI5. That absolutely wasn't the case for me. Getting to CI4 didn't really feel like a hump to me.
I feel like people always compare themselves to other people. Like they have an idealized image of what they want their genitals to look like. And everybody's genitals are different.
I think that's one of the hardest things about experiencing grief around CGM and restoring is that you will never really be able to know. It's just an unknown, like what your genitals would have been like had they been left alone. There are a ton of parallels between foreskin restoration and transitioning. I've experienced a lot of people in trans support groups who are talking about they have a lot of like grief and dysphoria on the fact they'll never know like how their body would have looked had they been assigned the gender at birth that they're like transitioning towards. And there's this idea that any like trans feminine person has a set breast size that is just determined by genetics. That's definitely a lot more complicated than that. But a lot of trans feminine people are like constantly questioning, is this how large my breast would have been if I were AFAB? And you can't know. And you also can't know what your genitals would have looked like if you were left intact.
Some people try to move past it by rationalizing, well, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to think about the future. But I think on some level, everybody at some point wonders, is this what it would have looked like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you've touched on this a bit before, but what would you say you like most about restoring? The process of restoring, or the end product, either way.
I will say, like, in terms of like the mental issues, like if I'm experiencing dysphoria or grief about it, restoration is something that I can actively do to help with that. And at some points when I'm not able to restore for whatever reason, I find it a little bit harder to work through those feelings. There's kind of two sides to that, though. Like it's also a reminder as opposed to just the other way around. It's a reminder both ways.
What do you like least about restoring? Because it sounds like those two might be kind of related to each other.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it's definitely a reminder of like CGM and in my life, and that it's also quite kind of tedious to remember as like maybe having ADHD or something like that, and also mildly uncomfortable. And like having to like work my wardrobe around restoring sometimes can be quite difficult. Like I have a lot of devices that these are more comfortable to wear at home, and then I have other ones that I need to do this so I can wear them out and not have like issues with that. And then having to bring something somewhere to put them in like my purse or things like that. Purses are great, I'll say. Can carry restoration stuff in them.
Have you ever experienced this where you just have to take off a device? It's uncomfortable, but now that it's off, where do I put it? How do I leave the bathroom?
Mm-hmm. I started having a habit of putting like a Ziploc in my purse. Also, honestly, the most annoying thing is that I have interstitial cystitis, and that comes with like some urinary incontinence and control issues. And I'm on medication for it now, which has helped a ton. But for some points in time, like I had to put on and take off a device like every 30 minutes or less. And that's like extremely frustrating. When I've gone in public with devices, let's say when I was working security, also on the issue of clothing before, unisex clothing almost always means men's clothing, but women can wear it too. Like if you get a unisex uniform, it's just a men's uniform. So it was a men's pair of pants, therefore it was baggy and amazing for concealing a device.
This next question is something that we've touched on a little bit, but I want to ask it directly. How has resentment and forgiveness kind of factored into your restoration journey?
So saying earlier on that resentment was one of the largest motivators when I had started restoring before that like gap in my restoration. And I wouldn't say that forgiveness has really appeared for me yet, or if ever. I don't necessarily think forgiveness is something that people need to do. It's something that there's an extreme amount of pressure to do from religious communities that I was raised in, and I think it's quite problematic in most cases. I think there's an ability to get past something without having to forgive the other person. The other person could have wronged you. Like there's no requirement to forgive them, I will say.
And forgiveness is something that needs to be earned. Society tends to think, oh, it's better for the person that is forgiving.
No, I don't think so. Yeah. I mean, like that's something people say just to get people to go along with them. It'll be easier for you if you forgive me, so please forgive me. When it's really the person on the other end that is wanting that forgiveness, or someone in power that has wronged someone in particular.
Because there is a uneven power dynamic when it comes to this whole issue, because it is being done on people that can't consent. It's not possible to consent. And even like cases where people are circumcised later in life, but it's against their will, that makes the power dynamic even more obvious. That
Yeah.
Looking back on your restoration journey, what would you have done differently?
I would say being less hard on myself. Like when I had that gap and just trying to repress it, I had mental stuff to work on, and maybe I just didn't necessarily have the space. My life was chaotic, and like a bit afterward, I was like very hard on myself, or like, why the heck did I stop? I would be done by now if I hadn't. And it's a lot more complicated of an issue than just restoring until you're done. There's so many issues that are intertwined in this, and I had a lot of other aspects of my identity that I had to work on, and I was in an abusive relationship for a lot of that, and it's just, I would say try to be less hard on myself. And yeah, and understanding of other people in that position too. Like I was saying, like almost nobody like jumps at like what is restoration immediately. Like that's something they have to work on themselves.
What would you say is next in your restoring journey?
A lot of the same. I feel like I've been telling myself, I'll be done in 2 years. I'll just keep doing exactly what I'm doing for about 2 years. And every now and then I'll try like some new stuff. And in particular, as like someone who's kind of a figurehead in community, is like, I want to gain a lot of like wide faceted experience just to help other people. I can't just like try one thing and like, this is what's worked for me only, I feel like, in my position. So a lot more experimentation, even if what I'm doing is already working for me. I also feel like it was a lot easier for me to start than some people because how early that I had figured out about it. And I kind of inadvertently tried tugging as a child, and I noticed that it worked. It wasn't super conscious of a decision. It was like I already had proof by the time I had learned that it was possible.
That is very interesting, because something that a lot of people struggle with is in the echo chamber of the internet and how there's a lot of false information out there. It's very easy to get discouraged and think, is this real? And it sounds like you never experienced that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's the anxiety, but like I had the like proof from my own experience, like it could be gaslighted out of it. Certainly I've heard people telling me, oh, it's impossible. And that's definitely a factor. But from my own experience, I had seen it work. Just before I had even learned that it could work. That's definitely not the most common experience, I would assume.
This is the question we always leave off on. What advice would you have for others that are considering restoration or are struggling staying motivated?
I may be biased in saying this, but find a support group, support network, and plug in if you are a leftist and having a lot of issues with the right wing and like some of the like conspiracies and the hate that could spread in a lot of groups. Is the Genital Autonomy Collective is explicitly intersectional and leftist and supportive of intersectional identities. And there is a support group called SIGA, Support for Affected Allies of Intersectional Genital Autonomy, that is basically the same thing, but inclusive of cis and parasex peoples. So finding support.
This podcast is hosted by Dick Guyver and edited by Open Roads. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the subscribe button and share it with your friends. Want to join our weekly video chat? Click the link in the show notes for details. We also need your help to keep this podcast going. For just $3 a month, you can help us pay for the podcast and inspire others in their foreskin restoration journeys. Thanks for listening, and look for new episodes coming soon.